Today's guest is someone who made a remarkable journey from journalism to federal politics and then back again into public life after one of Australia's closest election contests. Zoe Daniels is a respected journalist and author and former independent federal MP for Goldstein. Throughout her career, particularly in Parliament, Zoe has been a fierce champion for women's safety, economic equality, healthcare, climate action, eating disorder services and mental health. She also advocated for integrity in politics and a different style of leadership. Welcome to Monday Matters. I'm Ian Bunston. Zoe, thank you for joining us today. It's really a delight to have you on our program.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to start by unpacking possibly your journey from journalism to politics. You spent decades reporting on politics before stepping into the arena yourself. Looking back now, what surprised you most about being a politician that you could never have fully understood as a journalist?
Well, look, I think the most obvious thing is that journalists tend to think that they know what's going on. And now when I read the papers or look at the media coverage, and certainly during my time in the Parliament, it was clear to me that what was in the public domain was a very small portion of what was actually happening. Maybe 15 to 20% of what's going on is actually what's being reported in the papers and in the various news outlets. There's a lot more that happens behind the scenes in terms of interaction, negotiation, and discussion in the political realm than what gets reported. And the dynamics are a lot more complex, I think, than what you see in the mainstream media. And unfortunately, I think that the nuance in the way that things are reported in the mainstream media has drifted a lot over the time that I've been working as a journalist. I started working as a reporter in the early 90s, and journalism and media were obviously a lot different then. The business model's really been broken over that time. So journalists and media organisations tend to be chronically under-resourced. And I think what that leads to is a small amount of really good investigative coverage, but a lot of pretty thin coverage that's very unnuanced. And that's a reflection of the fact that journalists simply don't have the time. They're under so much deadline pressure. They're often reporting to multiple outlets simultaneously. And certainly as an ABC reporter, I started as a radio journalist only. And by the end of my career, I was doing everything from 30-second radio news to 30, 40-minute documentaries to reporting and writing for the website to 24-hour television news coverage, radio current affairs, across the entire spectrum. So you can see what kind of pressure that creates on individuals. And I think what that means is that the sort of old school shoe leather journalism where journos get to sort of wander the halls of Parliament, have deeper conversations about what's actually happening in the background has been lost to some degree. And that just means that what you're actually reading and seeing is often not quite the full picture. And I think that as an independent, and certainly, I generally don't speak for my independent colleagues, but I think broadly the way the crossbench operates is in a very collaborative way. The people who are sitting on the crossbench are there because they want a more collaborative type of politics. They want problem solving. They want to make a productive contribution. So their modus operandi is less party political and partisan and more let's get in and try and help support positive change. And so a lot of that involves more subtle interaction with the existing players to actually get outcomes. And that's not the kind of thing that you're going to see credited or reported in the media.
So that's a really great segue to my next question, because it's about your community impact. In your time as an MP, what type of impact do you believe that you were able to have on community development? Some of those things that I mentioned in the introduction, perhaps.
Well, I think that independent politics has really changed the face of a lot of electorates around the country. And in some ways, what you're seeing currently with One Nation, I think, is a manifestation of the fact that the advent of independence has actually opened people's minds to the fact that they can vote for someone other than the major parties. In my view, voting for One Nation is not a great manifestation of that, but I do think that they are linked to some degree. I think that in an electorate like Goldstein, which had been in its various iterations a conservative electorate only held by a male member since Federation, the introduction of the possibility or the opportunity to vote for an independent who sits in the political centre really opened people's minds to what was possible. And I mean, I had roughly 2,000 volunteers work on both of my campaigns. And so there's been a community impact that sort of transcends politics in a way. Those people have found each other, they've found their people, they've found sort of different ways of interacting with people in the community. They've done other things together. They've joined community organisations. Some of them now live together. Others travel overseas together, take holidays together. So they've built big networks as a result of community politics. And I think that it's also interesting to see a group of a lot of people come together who over their lifetime may have voted quite differently. Some have voted Liberal, some have voted Labor, some have voted Green. They then came together with a common goal of getting more direct community representation. So shedding this idea of being somewhere on the political spectrum or being politically partisan and working together for something. So it's actually been a really interesting and positive phenomenon. And I think even in the electorates where community independents have run and not been elected, it's still had a really positive impact on people because it's shown people that actually community can mobilise to change attitudes. And that's a really positive thing, win or lose.
Mm. So I'd like to pick up on a bit of the losing by a narrow margin. I know two mayors of the local elections who lost by very small margins. Now, if I'm correct, you lost your Goldstein electorate by about 175 votes after the recount. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, so it's 88 votes, so a margin of
Wow.
175. Yeah.
Wow, so close. That's incredibly close. What did that experience teach you about, say, resilience, and how did you process such a narrow result emotionally and personally?
Oh, look, it's interesting. I mean, Goldstein's now the second most marginal seat in the country. I think that, one aspect of it really was supporting my staff and my volunteers through that, to be honest. And I think even now, more than a year after the election, a lot of them are still in pain over it. Without going into it in detail, and people have probably read about it in the press, but the campaign itself was very toxic. And I think that people found it quite traumatic, actually, in many ways. There was an enormous amount of money that was spent in the electorate by what I'd call third-party organisations or proxies. There was a lot of misinformation and disinformation. There was big amounts of fossil fuel money, for example, and gambling industry money that came into the electorate, propagating negative information about me. And I think that, as the candidate, you do become quite resilient to that, and you sort of put up armour around that. But I think that a lot of my volunteers who were so invested and put in so much time found it extremely painful. And, a lot of them got personal blowback during the campaign as well. And so I think that's been really difficult for people. But I think that, as I've alluded to in the previous answer, there are a lot of positives that come out of community politics that actually are not measured by winning or losing. As I've said, Goldstein is now the second most marginal seat in Australia, having gone from being one of the most safe seats in the country. So that embeds accountability. And really, if you go to the core of what we were all looking for when I ran the first time back in, or before the 2022 election, a lot of it was about poor decision making, trying to improve decision making, improving integrity in politics via better transparency. And those kinds of things are now embedded in the Goldstein electorate because it's such a tight seat. There's a lot more media scrutiny on the seat, but also those who represent the seat now and into the future will have to be hyper aware of the fact that there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore, and that even in the seat of Goldstein, which had been broadly assumed to be a very safe Conservative seat, people can consider voting differently if they're presented with the right candidate and the right set of arguments.
My next question for you is a bit of a crystal ball question. It's about the future of Australia. Many Aussies feel increasingly disconnected from traditional politics. What changes do you believe are needed to just rebuild that trust between voters and those who represent them to provide, say, a level of hope for the future, do you think?
Well, I think that's kind of the key reason that I entered politics in the first place. I mean, I had come out of covering the first Trump administration as a foreign correspondent. So I was bureau chief in the US during the election of Trump in 2016, and I then spent that first Trump administration trying to understand why people had voted for Trump and sort of what was going on in America. And what I was really struck by was the fragmentation of trust in leadership, the feeling that people, particularly in the inland states, felt that they were disconnected from those who were leading them, that they felt that there was an elitism on the coasts, that they had lost hope for the future of their children, particularly in areas that had previously had very productive and prosperous manufacturing industries. For example, there was a sense that the local economies had collapsed, that they had been negatively affected by globalization of world trade, immigration, etc. You're now seeing exactly that kind of sentiment playing out in Australia. So the genesis or the basis of the community independence movement really is to try to build a really direct bridge between the constituency and the parliament, and to create a form of deliberative democracy to some degree, or at the very least participatory democracy, where people feel that they can get involved, that they can interact directly with their MP, and that their concerns are then transmitted directly to the leadership and to the parliament. It takes time. It takes time to build that. And, you know, there's a little bit sort of two steps forward, one step back from my perspective, having narrowly lost my seat. But, you know, you have a group of community independents who are quite embedded in the parliament now. And certainly the feedback that I get around is that people appreciate having those independent voices and that they understand that it gives them the kind of accountability that they're looking for from people who will speak up for them on issues that perhaps the major parties won't, due to sometimes vested interests and power dynamics that have been entrenched in Australian politics for a long time.
Now, Zoe, you mentioned about losing or narrowly losing your seat in 25, but since that time you've continued to shape public debate through writing, speaking and advocacy. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm doing all sorts of things. I deliberately have avoided taking a full-time job just to give myself freedom to sort of work across the areas that I'm interested in and things that align to my thinking. So I'm the independent chair of Mental Health Victoria, which is a peak body for both mental health organisations, but also represents the Victorian community in terms of human need in regard to mental health services. I write for The Guardian, so I write comment for The Guardian and sort of therefore keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in terms of public sentiment. And then a lot of my other work is around public speaking, but also working with organisations that I have some alignment with around advocacy. So particularly not-for-profit organisations in things like the community legal space, women's and family and sexual violence space, those sorts of organisations that really need to get traction with government to create systems change. And then my other big piece of work that I'm working on currently is around community connection. So going to some of the issues that you've mentioned, trying to rebuild bridges between people, enable, conversations that are more productive in an environment where I think people find it difficult to have conversations when they disagree. And I think that's a big part of the fragmentation issue that we have, and social media and the digital environments playing a big part in that as well. So that's kind of the spectrum of the kind of work that I'm doing.
Well, look, Zoe, it's been a real privilege to have you as a guest here at Monday Matters, and thank you for sharing your insights and reflections with us today. Your journey through journalism, politics, and public advocacy offers a unique perspective on where Australia has been and where it may be heading. And thank you to everyone listening today. Also, if you've really enjoyed today's episode, be sure to share it with a friend and join us next time for another conversation with guest Peter Slattery, who is riding around Australia on his motorbike, having conversations of all things about mental health. He'll be coming live from the most northern tip of Australia, Cape York.